At some point soonish, I want to make a video on the golden age of science fiction in general. But one thing I've wanted to talk about for a while are there are three writers from that era who I really like. They're my three favorite writers from that era. Three of, I think, the most unique voices. And two of them in particular are pretty obscure today, at least outside of older people who grew up with them, like my father's generation, or people like me who have dug deep into the history of science fiction. And I think part of it might be that they have more of a niche appeal to people like me who are neurodivergent, but that's also, if you're watching my channel, you're more likely to be someone like that, so I want to talk about them. And I've already talked a lot about Jack Vance, who I've mentioned is my favorite overall writer of fiction at all. He wrote some mysteries too, most of which I don't like as much, but I like the Bane novels, and I changed my mind on Bad Ronald. But he's best known for his science fiction and fantasy. And this book, there are a couple stories I would include that aren't in here and a couple in here that I would take out, but overall I would say it has most of his best work, and you can get a DRM-free ebook, and it's also, of the Subterranean Jack Vance editions, generally the easiest one to get an affordable copy. And Jack Vance, I'm going to make more videos just on him. He tended not to write a lot of stories in the same world. His Demon Princes, he had 3 books in that world, and he had some other trilogies that were longer, might have had more words in a given world. But in general, he would write a world, and then he often wouldn't come back to it, especially with a lot of his short stories. And a lot of what he did was conceptual, and a lot of his storytelling, I realized, is driven by a very specific kind of person who is similar to Vance and similar to me, interacting with this world and finding ways to master it. And one thing I would like to do if I can achieve success in business and people will take this seriously is try to get permission from his estate to write a collection of his stories that relate to entrepreneurship and self-help type advice that I've found, with introductions to each story with me talking about the connections, because I think a lot of his stories illustrate a lot of concepts that I think primed me to get this when I read them. And when I reread him for the first time, because I've read most of his stuff like 3 times at this point, so on my first second read, it was because someone was saying, well, did he write good characters? Because I like good character work, and a lot of older science fiction writers didn't do good character work. So I reread it, and my first impression was most of his protagonists are the same. And then I came back to it later, second reread, and I realized they're really not. As I've realized what ADHD people, the variations we tend to have, there are different kinds of like ADHD people in his characters with different personalities. They're just all different from the neurodivergent world in the same way. But I've also had people try to read him and tell me they don't understand why his characters do what they do. So I think if you are not similar to his characters, that's confusing. And that might be, I wondered, because he was supposedly very popular at the time and considered like a pulp writer, and then now he's considered a very niche highbrow writer who people reference but don't read. And I think a big part of it is I read his autobiography and I realized his fans were people like other writers, like publishers, like editors, and they would keep pushing his books on an audience who at the time was more likely to be neurodivergent, more likely to be tolerant of stuff like that, and also just looking for anything in that space. And so, yeah, I love Jack Vance, but I've talked about him before and I'll talk about him more. So the other 2 writers will also talk about more, and I've talked about one of them before. And then we have Cordwainer Smith, this is the pseudonym, the pen name of Paul Linebarger, who was a U.S. diplomat specializing in the East Asia department. And a lot of ways he's similar to Vance, and then there are some things where he's kind of the opposite. So like Vance, as I said, rarely stuck to the same world. All of Simac's work, all of his short work is in this one book, and then he wrote one novel in Australia. So he didn't write nearly as prolifically as Vance, and everything he wrote was in this same universe. Like most of Vance's work, he didn't have aliens in this universe. It's all humans and human interactions. And both of them kind of had a bleak, cynical, and yet also kind of optimistic view of humanity, I would say, which I think is why I like it. They also both often had themes of genetic engineering. They also both had distinctive writing styles. Vance was sort of notorious for writing in a way that people might now consider purple prose. And a lot of this was him. Science fiction markets had word limits, and he was trying to get around that by using very specific words, right? So instead of using a whole sentence, see if you can get it into like one $10 word. And Cordwainer Smith, the language is not necessarily as distinctive, but the style feels very poetic to me. And my father recommended both this guy and the next guy I will talk about. I think he recommended some other people too, and this was, I discovered Vance and some other people I liked, and he, based on what I was saying I liked, correctly predicted I would like both of these writers. And I've read all of his short fiction twice, but second time was a while ago, so I probably want to reread this at some point. And Australia I only read once, his one novel. And there's other like humor writers I might recommend as well, but these three are the most salient overall in terms of all their work. Although there's also a couple of classic stories by other writers that I want to talk about at some point. But these are just general like writers who wrote a lot that I think is worthwhile and very distinctive. And then finally, and this one is probably the best known of these three, is Clifford Simak. And his friend and literary executor after he died went and had to... So a lot of science fiction writers, their work was... The copyright was taken by the publishers, and then Congress wrote in a clawback provision after, I think it's 15 years, maybe 25, some amount of time, where you could get your rights back. And so Vance's estate did that. Simak's did not, and so his stuff, a lot of it's in public domain on Gutenberg, and the stuff that's not in public domain, his executor had to go and get the rights from these people who got the rights back when that was the norm. And so this is Open Road Media, which is an imprint of one of the big publishing houses, so the books are, unfortunately, unlike a lot of science fiction, not DRM free. But the physical books are, I think they're Lightning Source, yeah, they're Lightning Source, but they're quality. And they are, this is, one of his most famous stories is Dusty Zebra, and I think this is one of the better collections. And I haven't read all of his short fiction. I read a lot of it, especially the public domain stuff when I was younger, and then my father had some of his books too. And then I have all these collections, and sometimes I'll just go and I'll read Clifford Simak because he is a very humane, uplifting writer, and his stories are generally set in the near future and set on Earth, although he also often has themes of parallel Earth. And he is more optimistic, I would say, than either Vance or Cordwainer Smith, which I think might be why he is more well-known today, because people today really like grimdark, and while Vance and Smith were dark, they were still hopeful, but they weren't super optimistic and super humanistic, whereas some of Simak's stories were dark, but in general, like, he was a very light-hearted, humanistic writer, I would say. And so anyway, so these three writers, Vance, who I've mentioned before, Simak I mentioned a while ago, and Cordwainer Smith, who I don't think I've mentioned before, although if you look at, I have in a couple of places, a shot of carefully picked books on the bookshelf, mostly books that I read and really liked, and then a few that I picked because they were purple. And that book is on the shelf because of the Nesfa Press books that I have. This is probably my most treasured book from Nesfa Press. And so anyways, wanted to talk about these writers quickly, and as I said, at some point I'll do at least one more video on the golden age of science fiction in general. But thanks for watching. I'm Magpie, and I'll see y'all in the next one.